Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
A chance encounter at a party, or is it? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy it! The minds went off in sync. For a few seconds, bright flames illuminated the jungle. The sound of an explosion followed. Above the big hangar, a bright blaze of fire erupted. A short time later, the ammunition warehouse burst into flames. Fragments of structures and roof fragments flew in different directions. Then the shells and rockets stored in the warehouse exploded. It was like a New Year's Eve fireworks display, bursting with bright lights. It even felt like I was back in my childhood. On my shoulder rested the heavy hand of combat. "Stop staring, let's go." He gave me a gentle nudge. "Give the order to retreat." "I'm Harpoon 92, to the rendezvous point." I repeated the command several times and let go of the tangent and went to reception. All groups acknowledged the command I had received. The bushes swayed a little to my right, and I saw Koida. Without saying anything, he threw his machine gun over his shoulder and pointed his hand in the direction of the assembly area. We drew up in a single file and started to make our way through the thorn bushes. It dawned instantly here in the tropics. It was light by the time we reached the designated spot in half an hour. Having sent out a reconnaissance party and assigned 2 men to the rear guard, we started on our way back. I walked ahead, with my weapon behind my back, my navigator on, and a glowing green screen from time to time. So far so good. We were alert, ready to engage at any moment. In perfectly fitted gear, with ammunition and equipment in their patch pockets and pouches, the soldiers sprang after each other, keeping their distance. The only indulgence I could allow them on the march was to loosen the straps on their protective helmets. I checked the navigator again. The river was near. Soon the jungle would be over, and we would be on the bank. There was a booming thud from above. I put my binoculars to my eyes. I could see black spots as they came swiftly into view. The 2 planes were taking their time to make a turn and then, as they neared ground level, launched volley after volley of unguided rockets. In the morning sky, there appeared white traces of rockets rushing toward us. Having dropped their lethal load, the aircraft gently rocked their wings and went right, almost engaging the treetops with their wings. Ahead, 500 meters away, bright flames burst into flames, explosions broke out, and black smoke rose over the forest. We were just about to run. It was clear that we had been spotted. At last, we saw a gap in the dense trees ahead. I looked around. No planes were in sight. They had used up all their ammunition and gone back to base. But we mustn't relax. I took my flare gun out of its holster. The flare, a green star, burst upward from the narrow river valley overgrown with thorny scrub. We took up a circular defense, listening intensely to the silence. In about 20 minutes, the sound of screws was heard from the north. It was getting closer, and soon 2 low-flying machines appeared over the forest. It was obvious that the pilots had given full power to the turbines, going into a steep turn to throw off the enemy's supposed anti-aircraft gunners. It was as if they were connected by an invisible thread and synchronously repeated each other's maneuvers. As they approached their targets, the pilots pressed their helicopters ever closer to the ground, almost touching the treetops that were whizzing by from below. "Attention, stand by." I gave the command and raised my hand. "I'm Ambassador 22. We're landing." I could hear it through my headphones. The steel dragonflies hovered over the beach and began to descend slowly onto the rocky shore. As I watched the landing process, I suddenly could clearly see through the dust a group of armed men walking down the high bank of the river. They were about 300 yards away. 10 o'clock enemy," I commanded curtly. To my right, with an intricate swear word, Koida fired a long burst from the RPK. The pursuers quickly scattered among the rock debris and returned fire. The lead wasps snapped at the lightly armored hulls of the helicopters, and 2 or 3 of them hissed inside, luckily not hitting anything. Combat muttered and turned to me. "Come on, load up. I'll get in a second helicopter." I lay my face on the burnt African grass and watched the bullets create dust fountains all around, as fragments of stones and scraps of turf scattered. It didn't take long to load, and in a few minutes, everyone was in position. As I pulled myself together, I picked up the moment when the enemy weakened their fire and wanted to jump quickly inside the helicopter. And then they got me. It was like being hit on the back with a red-hot rod. My legs buckled, and I realized that I was not going to make it to my helicopter. But Koida, running behind me, picked me up by my belt and threw me into the chopper in one fell swoop. He jumped in last, continuing to fire his machine gun. The enemy, now and then, changed his position, persistently firing at the helicopters. But we managed to hold them to the ground with heavy fire. I saw several camouflaged figures dashing around. I felt no pain, but I could hear the blood running down my back. I pushed my hand into the back of the pilot. "Let's go before they shoot us down." The turbines whistled a little louder, and the helicopter sped upward, leaving the riverbed, under the protection of the high bank. The second helicopter followed, and a second one dropped on its tail. The helicopters raced over the river, blasting the brown waters with their propellers. I pulled my flight helmet over my head and tapped into the flight line. "The valley is too narrow, and they might get us if there's an ambush ahead," rumbled through my head. And then, as if reading my mind, a stinger hit us from the right bank. It was so fast that the pilots of the second helicopter had not even noticed when it launched. The rocket hit right on the port side. Instantly the contact fuse went off, and the steel dragonfly turned into a shapeless ball of fire, scattering debris, hit the water scattering a myriad of fiery spray, tearing human bodies to shreds. I looked at Koida. He nodded. Combat was no longer with us. I groaned mentally, staring at the rapidly rising column of thick smoke behind me, and fell into blackness. I was badly wounded. It was a very dangerous wound, and I had lost a lot of blood, and when I was taken to the hospital, I was in critical condition. I grew up without my mother. She left me and my father when I was barely a year old. I found out a long time later that she had run off with a lover. Apparently, there was no place in her happy future for me. My family tried not to mention my mother. Only once my grandmother said that my mother had gone to get a happy life and was now living somewhere abroad. I did not specify anything, and my grandmother never returned to this conversation. My father never married, devoting all his time to work. Did he love me? It was hard to say unequivocally. At any rate, I lived at my grandmother's, and my father occasionally visited me, bringing me some penny toy. He devoted his life to work and his career. He got lucky and now owned a big, thriving construction company. A year later, my grandmother died and bequeathed the apartment to her other daughter. By that time, I had gone to military school, and the question of housing did not interest me. After graduation, my military service began. Being on my first leave, I met Vera. We immediately connected. I returned to the service with a young wife. A year later, my daughter Sasha was born. Our little family went through a lot of trials and safely made it to our 20th anniversary. During all these years, Vera not only has not lost her attractiveness, but on the contrary, she has become even more beautiful. When you love someone, everything seems better than it really is. The only thing that overshadowed our life was business trips. But it seemed to me that the separation made our family even stronger. I am now 41 years old, and Vera is a year younger. She's had a pretty good career. She is now the head doctor of a huge medical center. As it turns out, she is a great organizer. I am still in the army, but I have already decided to end my career. Enough is enough. It is time to devote myself to my family. Especially now Sasha is expecting a wedding, and it seems that the long-awaited grandchildren are just around the corner. We bought a 2-bedroom apartment and we're about to start building a cottage in a prestigious area. At the beginning of September, I left on a business trip. When I left, I told Vera it was for the last time and that I would stay home for good. We stood and kissed like crazy for a long time, and then I left. I threw back the tent flap and stepped under the sun-heated tarpaulin. To the left, the blades of a big fan rustled, creating the illusion of a cool breeze. "Sit down, Edward." Koida used his boot to pull a folding stool from under an aluminum table. Then he deftly poured vodka into the aluminum mugs. Saved it for a special occasion. He nodded at the bottle. I didn't think it would be like this. We drank in silence and poured a second one. To combat, may the earth be his. Koita closed his eyes. He was silent. Good luck, don't disappear. I stood up. The colonel stayed here. He had nowhere to go back to. No family, no home. I didn't know exactly what had happened in his past life. But there was clearly something that was keeping him from living in this world in peace. Koita sighed and filled his mugs. Come on, let's have some of that. No sooner had my plane landed than I tried to call Vera. I couldn't wait to tell my wife that I was home and that I would see her soon. But her cell phone didn't answer, so I called her at work. The phone picked up her secretary. Hello. Chief Physician's office. What can I do for you? On the tube sounded an unfamiliar voice. Hello, may I speak with Vera? I asked politely. Vera is not at work. Who is calling and what can I say to her? The secretary was no less polite than me. It is her husband. I really need to see her. Can you tell me where she can be? The secretary was silent for a while, as if collecting her thoughts. Then she hummed and said, if it is a joke, it's a very bad one. And, without saying goodbye, hung up. I stood there for a few minutes, unable to collect my thoughts. What the hell? I took a cab and drove home. When I opened the door, I walked into our apartment. I got the impression that no one lived here. I ran my hand over the kitchen table. Dust gathered on my finger. The situation was becoming more and more incomprehensible. I went to my room and took off my uniform. I wondered where my wife was. I called my daughter. Her phone was also disconnected. Where the hell are they? Rinsed myself in the shower and changed my clothes. Took a bottle of whiskey out of my duffel bag and poured half a cup. I didn't understand anything yet. After half an hour, I got dressed more or less decently and called a cab. I decided to go to Vera's place of work to do a reconnaissance of the area. Mingling with the crowd of patients, I slipped past security and made my way to the front desk. He who has ears, let him hear. Two young women were loudly discussing the upcoming New Year's Eve party. It was to be held today in the restaurant at the Plaza Hotel. I listened. The girls were rambling on and on until they announced the time of the party, 6 p.m. For some reason, I really wanted to attend this event. I was not surprised to see a sign on the door announcing that the restaurant was closed for the event. I have been here several times before with both my wife and friends. The restaurant has separate dining rooms, and I assumed the party was taking place in one of them. The big man blocking the doorway looked at me suspiciously. Do you have an invitation? Oh, shit. I tried calling my wife again, but her phone was still disconnected. I turned to the man at the door. Look, it's a corporate event at the Regional Medical Center. My wife is supposed to be there. I just flew in today, and I can't reach her. Her name is Levin Vera. She is definitely here. I tried to explain. The security guard shook his head, entrance by invitation only. I have strict instructions, no invitation, no entry, I can't do anything. You can just give her the message that I'm here. I tried to keep my cool and not push it. I could see that the guard was hesitating. Then he said something into the microphone sticking out of his breast pocket. A few minutes later, the door swung open and an unfamiliar young woman came out to us and gave me an intriguing look. I repeated to her what I had told the guard. Can you prove that you are the husband of Vera? I threw her a surprised look. Of course, I can. And who are you? I rummaged in my pocket and handed her my passport. I am Elena, her personal assistant. The stranger answered, scrutinizing the document. Check the marriage stamp. I prompted her. She checked, looked at the guest list on her phone, and gave me a confused look. Vera is here. She hesitated for a moment, with her husband and daughter. I stood there as if stunned. In my head rang 1,000 bells. With her husband? I muttered. And me, then who? The woman shrugged her shoulders. Another guard loomed up behind her. I'll let you through, but I hope you will not do anything stupid. The woman turned to the guards. Let him through. As she passed, I heard Elena say softly to the guard, "Keep an eye on him." From behind the closed double doors at the far end of the foyer came the sounds of music. I dropped my jacket in the check room and went into the hall. The restaurant's large banquet hall was decorated in New Year's Eve style. In the middle of it, there was a large Christmas tree, decorated with toys and illuminated garlands, the top of which reached the ceiling. Tables were moved and set to one side of the room, leaving space for couples to dance in front of a low stage where a live band played, providing the music. Apparently, there was a break, and people were hanging out on the dance floor. My eyes worked in alert mode, as if scanning the dimly lit hall. Vera was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, I saw Vera's deputy staff member. I knew him. He had been to our company several times. I approached him and politely took him under my elbow. "Hello, Vadim. Do you know where Vera is?" I asked, overhearing the music. He threw me a shocked look. "Don't worry, she's fine," he said, but as he spoke, there was something in his gaze that flickered across the hall, making me nervous. Then he gestured toward the far end of the hall. I went down that way, making my way carefully between the dancers. From the corner of my eye, I saw that Vadim continued to stare at me dazedly. Vera, dressed in a short burgundy dress, stood surrounded by men. Next to her, wearing a chic tuxedo, stood an imposing man. He held her by the elbow with one hand and discreetly stroked her backside with the other. Our daughter Sasha was standing next to her. They were discussing something merrily and laughing from time to time. I came almost close and asked loudly, "Vera, what's going on here?" She flinched as if struck and slowly turned to me. "Edward? How did?" she said, and, without saying anything, she fainted in the arms of the man standing behind her. I turned my gaze to my daughter and shuddered. She reeked of icy cold. "Help me! Vera is not well. She needs to be moved to the restroom." Vera's companion picked her up in his arms and carried her toward the door. I did not understand anything. "Wait! That's my wife. Get your hands off her." I took a step toward the man holding Vera. He shuddered, hearing the anger in my voice. Elena, who was standing nearby, looked at me frightened. She touched a finger to her ear and said, "Guards, Wait!" I looked at her. Who is this man? Why is he groping my wife with his hands? But no one answered my questions. Everyone, including my daughter, stood there and looked at me in silence. Why is he still here? Where are the guards? The man was already shouting. I froze in place. I wanted to go over to Vera, to help, to tell her that I loved her, that I hadn't stopped thinking about her for a second, but I couldn't make my legs obey. But the other half of my brain was thinking at the same time about who was around my wife now, how far their relationship had come. I turned to my daughter. "Sasha, will you please explain?" Sasha looked at me, with ill-concealed contempt and anger. "You have ruined everything." She turned away. She didn't even say, "Daddy." I was picked up by the guards who came to the door. I saw Vera, who had fallen unconscious, being carried out of the hall. The picture in my eyes began to blur. It was clear that I could get nothing now. I could knock out half of those present, including the guards, and I would probably end up behind bars. Then I certainly wouldn't know what had happened. I threw up my hands and left without looking back. The whole situation was strange and clearly out of control. "My jacket," I said sharply to the woman behind the checkroom counter. While I waited for her to bring it in, the door opened behind me. I turned around, still hoping for something. But there stood the freak who had been with Vera, with a contemptuous smirk on his face. "You lost, warrior. Both she and her daughter know that I am the better choice for them." I roared and took a step toward him, clenching my fists. But I was stopped by the large hand of the guard standing between us. "I'm sorry, but I have my orders." "You must leave," he said. "And you," he jabbed at Vera's companion, who stepped aside and stood in the open doorway, "will you please go back into the hall?" I took my jacket, walked through the front door, and dove into the dank chill of the December night. The security guard watched me closely as I hailed a cab. I still had hope that the door behind me would open, and my wife and daughter would hurry after me. A yellow cab pulled up to the curb. I climbed into the back seat and gave the address. I had to get my things. I didn't want to stay in that apartment. I asked the driver to wait, quickly went up to the apartment, and gathered my stuff. I stared at our wedding photo, which was covered with a thin layer of dust. Then I sighed and slammed the door, leaving my past life behind. Now I have to look for shelter. I would probably have to rent something for a while. I got on the phone again. There was plenty of housing. I searched through the ads and found a suitable option. For a relatively small amount of money, a small studio apartment was for rent in the old part of town. I dialed the number. The small 2-story house, made of red brick with a red painted roof, resembled a fairy tale gnome. The 5-story buildings blocked the sunlight, and during the day the gnome was always in shadow. Apparently, this is why the price was relatively low. There were only 4 apartments in the house. A small front garden had been laid out in front of the front door, but now only the stalks of last year's weeds were sticking out of the snow. The landlady met me on the porch. We said hello, and the old woman invited me up to the 2nd floor. It was my grandfather's apartment. We had wanted to sell it for a long time, but he flatly refused to move. He said only after his death. She said, heavily climbing the steps we took his things out, only the furniture is left. It's old, but you need something to eat and sleep on. The landlady met me on the porch. We exchanged greetings, and the old woman invited me up to the 2nd floor. It was my grandfather's apartment. We had wanted to sell it for a long time, but he flatly refused to move. He said only after his death. She said, heavily climbing the steps we took his things out, only the furniture is left. It's old, but you need something to eat and sleep on. The landlady opened the door and turned on the light. I went into a wood-finished hallway. The door to the only room was open. The room was a long, wide rectangle. A thick burgundy carpet covered the parquet floor. Dark oak panels rose from the floor to halfway up the wall, where antique, barely faded wallpaper rushed toward the high 4-meter ceiling. There was an old sofa in the room, with a broken leg that had been replaced by several books. Opposite the sofa was an iron bed, topped on both sides with nickel-plated balls, like cannonballs. There had once been paintings on all the walls, even in the kitchen. Now there were nails hammered into the wall and rectangles of unfaded wallpaper in their place. Grandpa played a little. The landlady caught my gaze and said. I stepped closer and ran my fingers over the strings. There was a rattling sound of a distressed instrument. I was satisfied. The hostess took the money and disappeared. I wanted to eat, so despite fatigue, I had to go get some food and drink. I closed the door, went down the street, and headed to the supermarket, which was not far away, on the same street. After walking around the sales floor, I loaded the cart with groceries, paid, and rolled it to the counter. I took out a bag, reached for the cart, intending to move the groceries, and came face to face with a homeless person. I wanted to chase them away, but for some reason, I felt sorry for them and even gave them some bills. To my surprise, I saw that it was a woman. I took the bag and hurried to my temporary shelter. I forgot about the homeless woman instantly. I got home just as the snow began to fall in earnest. Finally, I sat down on the old, worn leather couch and closed my eyes. Thoughts assaulted my brain. What had happened? Why was my daughter talking to me like that? And my wife? Her fainting when she saw me. It looked like I wasn't expected and had been written off from all accounts. My card was bursting with money. At least there was no problem here. But the rest was a mess. I decided not to be so hot and not to worry myself unnecessarily. Everything would be solved sooner or later. But in one thing I was sure, as it was, will never be. I must have dozed off because I woke up to a strange sound coming from the front door. I cautiously looked out of the room. Someone was trying to open the front door. But the key sticking out of the keyhole at my side was interfering. Someone fiddled with the lock and realizing that the lock would not open, fell silent. I stood up and listened. It was quiet behind the door. You can't hide from problems, you have to solve them. I went to the door, turned the key, and jerked the knob sharply toward me. It was half dark on the landing. The dimly lit, fly-covered light bulb could not fully illuminate the stairwell. Someone on the right stirred. I turned my head. The homeless woman I had seen outside the supermarket was staring at me frightened. It looked like this woman was as hard to get rid of as a cockroach. Where did she come from, watching me? We stared at each other in silence until the door downstairs slammed. She ran in here. You stay downstairs, and I'll go upstairs and take a look. A voice came from downstairs, and someone shining a flashlight started up the stairs. Police. That was all I needed now. I grabbed the homeless woman by the dirty collar and pushed her into the apartment. Carefully, so as not to make any noise, I closed the door and turned the key. I turned to the woman and put my finger to my lips. A voice sounded behind the door. There's nobody here, and the attic is locked. All right, let's go. She's not going anywhere. Sooner or later, she'll get caught. Heavy footsteps rumbled up the stairs. The door slammed. I looked cautiously out the window. A police car with its blue blinker on was pulling away from the house. You can stay here while the cops are here, I said. Then get out of here. Thank you, she said quietly. Look, I don't want to offend you, but you're as dirty as a sack of potatoes, and you stink. There's a bathroom over there. Go and wash up. When I said that, I felt sick. Good Samaritan. Maybe she's sick or lousy. The only thing I need right now to be happy is a louse. Throw her out and be done with it. What about the police? All right, she'll wash up and get out. But there was something else that kept me from throwing her out. Maybe the feeling that I myself was homeless, like her, only with pockets full of money. Without saying a word, the woman went into the bathroom. After a few moments, I heard the shower running. I went into the room and pulled a towel out of my duffel bag. Then I opened the bathroom door, expecting the shower curtain to be closed. She was standing in a very deep cast iron tub with the shower on full blast and fiercely washing the dirt off herself. She stood with her back to me and hummed. I was amazed. It was like a work of art. She reminded me of a picture of Europe emerging from the sea. The woman's skin was a pale, milky color as she washed off the dirt and soot. The washed hair fell in a white wave down her back, ending at her waist. Several fresh bruises were visible on her back. Her legs seemed very long. Her hips were narrow, and her butt was nicely shaped. I had an idea that if you cram a few portions of food into her, her fifth place would be impressive. It was as if the stranger felt my gaze and turned around. I saw her breasts. They were not very big, but very appetizing. The woman blushed and stared at me point blank. She stood there, making no attempt to cover herself. May I continue? Did you see everything you wanted to see? She asked me a little angrily. Are you, by any chance, a pervert? Just brought a towel. I muttered and felt that I was beginning to get angry, too. Fuck you. I hissed. No one asked you to come here. You're free to leave at any minute. I kicked the pile of dirty clothes in her direction, squeamishly. Wait, she said and lowered her arms, revealing her body completely, and added doomfully. Look, if you want. I didn't mean to stare at you, I said conciliatorily. I knocked, but you didn't hear me. I hung up my towel. Then why did you stand there and look at me? She asked. Because I'm a normal man, I said. And man, that's how you spell man. When we see without clothes women, we get dumb. But I'm dirty and ugly. She started. And, in addition, blind. I said. So, I'll just take your dirty rags and bring a tracksuit. Walking out of the bathroom, I sighed heavily. I needed to get out of this room before she noticed how hard my little brother was. During the time I'd been on a business trip, I hadn't been with any women. I knew beautiful women were like an expensive car, nice to look at and think about, but only theoretically. Beautiful women were too expensive, too difficult to handle, and totally unreliable to mess with, especially since I was married. I closed the door and stuffed her dirty, stinky clothes into a garbage bag, then put them out in the stairwell. Returning to the room, I pulled out my tracksuit. It would be too big for her, but it would do for a while. Then I caught myself thinking, for now? Am I going to keep her overnight? A strange woman? Where to put her? There's only one bed. The other half of my brain whispered, and where to put her in the cold? Call the police again. I decided to let her sleep until morning, and I could sleep in a chair at night. Looking out the window, I saw that the snowfall had intensified. Flakes of snow filled the street and the roofs of houses. Okay, let it stay until morning. The door creaked open, and a woman dressed in my tracksuit entered the room. She'd tucked the sleeves and pants up, but it still hung on her like a hanger. Is the police car still there? She asked. It looks like they're gone, but I don't know how far. Maybe they just turned off their blinkers and lay low, I replied, trying to put some fear into her. But you can't leave yet anyway. I threw away your stinking rags. What am I supposed to do now? She said helplessly. I have nothing else to wear. Stay till tomorrow. I will give you some warm clothes, and you can go anywhere you want, I answered. What am I supposed to do until tomorrow? She looked at me, frightened. Let's go to the kitchen, I suggested. First of all, the guest needs to be fed. She followed me into the kitchen and looked around. I opened the refrigerator, and she sighed sorrowfully. I could see she hadn't had a decent meal in a long time. I took out some sausage and canned meat, then carefully placed a tray of eggs on the table. In a minute, there were scrambled eggs on the griddle, and an open can of stew was warming. I coarsely sliced bread with my tactical knife and put the food on a large plate. Then I took a package of birch juice from the fridge and poured it into a big glass. Bon appetit, I said, putting a fork in front of her. Excuse me, but do you not have a knife? She asked guiltily. I silently put a table knife next to her plate. She pounced on the food as if she hadn't eaten in a long time. Well, I will not interfere, I said, returning to the room. I felt like smoking, so I went out to the stairwell. I found myself waiting for Vera to call. She knows my cell phone number. I pulled out the phone. Damn it! It was out of charge. A thought flashed through my mind. Maybe she had already called. I needed to charge my phone right away. When I returned to the room, the woman was sitting on the floor with her legs tucked under her. I looked at her in surprise. Why don't you sit down on the couch? I didn't know how you'd feel about me sitting on your furniture, she said. I shrugged, pulled the blanket and pillow off the bed, and threw it on the couch. Go lie down. Thank you, she smiled. I decided to let her sleep until she woke up on her own. I looked at my cell phone. Almost charged. I turned the phone on. Several missed calls and text messages from an unfamiliar number. I opened the first one. An hour after I left the corporate retreat. Edward! We need to talk. Edward, where are you? Answer me. There's been a terrible mistake. We need to talk. Edward! Don't be silent. We have to meet and talk. Edward! I'm going crazy. And so on in the same vein. This must be Vera's new number. I looked at my watch. 3:30 in the morning. I went out to the kitchen and dialed the number. They answered right away. Edward? I recognized Verina's voice immediately. Edward, is that you? Hello, Vera. Spasms gripped my throat. I'm very glad to hear you. Edward! There's been a terrible mistake. I was told that you died 6 months ago. I saw the documents. You burned up in a downed helicopter, and your body was never found. That's what they told me at the military enlistment office. That's why there was no funeral. They told you at the enlistment office? I was shocked. Yes, and they showed me a telegram from your unit. Vera cried into the phone. I got sick and went to the hospital. It's so bad that you got married so quickly. My heart ached. Edward, I was sick. Dennis helped me through the grief, he supported me. She was already sobbing. We have to meet. I'll explain everything. Where are you now? I asked with a secret hope. We're I live in the country, in Dennis's cottage. Sasha lives with us. Come to our apartment tomorrow. I didn't change the locks. Vera sobbed. I'll be there in the morning. I love you. I wanted to ask her about her daughter, but my heart was already hurting unbearably. All right. I'll call you tomorrow. I hung up. So this smug name is Dennis. All right, I'll wait until morning. I went back to the room. The woman was awake and sitting with her feet up. I looked at her. I knew that she wanted to ask me something. I also knew she would have a hard time doing it. You can stay until morning. I'll give you some warm clothes, and then you can go. I already told her that. Is there no possibility of staying here? Only for the night. Quietly she asked. I was silent for a long time. There is such a possibility. I said slowly. But I'm afraid you will hate me for it. Do you want me to sleep on the floor or in the kitchen? Are you afraid that I will disturb you? A glimmer of hope flashed in her eyes. I'm used to it, as long as I have a roof over my head. I want you to sleep with me. My mouth was dry. In my bed. I'll pay you. What? She put her hand over her mouth. I'm sorry. I already regretted that I said that, but I can't stop thinking about you. It's impossible. She moved cautiously to the edge of the couch. I'm homeless. But I'm not a society girl. Oh, I'm sorry. I must have overreacted. It's just that I haven't had a woman in a long time. There was a pause. I was a little angry about her rejection. The usual male lust was at work in me. I'll do it, she said suddenly. If you let me stay for a few days, you can spend the night with me. But you can't kick me out if it's not what you expect. I'm not a prostitute. Except when I've been raped. I haven't done it in a long time. She said dolefully. She looked me straight in the eye, and I felt like the biggest, most heartless scumbag in the world. 2 long lines of tears ran down her face, and every word sounded as if it had been carved from her very soul. Don't, stay on the couch, or move to the bed if you want, I said. I really wanted a woman. That woman. After the twists and turns of fate for the day, I just wanted to forget myself. The cure was either vodka or intim. I wanted someone to feel sorry for me, to say a kind word. Even if it was completely false and corrupt. There was no motherly warmth and affection in my life. Yes, it seems that I did not turn out to be an idiot. In the short time that I had her, my perception of life has changed. The intruder had become a person to me, and no matter how I felt about women, I was glad to have her around. Now there was no way I would send her back out on the street. I stood at the window and watched the falling snow. Okay, it was long past my bedtime. I turned around and froze in place. She was standing without clothes and looking at me. I picked her up in my arms and gently placed her on the bed. My name is Natasha, she whispered, before giving herself up. When we finished, and I leaned back, she looked at me. Tell me, if I were ugly, would you want me? There were tears in her eyes, but there was no anger in her voice. She seemed completely resigned to her fate. Yes, a woman, always a woman. Shall I sleep here with you? She asked. If you like. Good night, Natasha turned her face toward the wall. The sun was shining brightly, emitting a piercingly cold white light, making it impossible to see the figure on the opposite shore. The man put the pipe on his shoulder and froze. I was trying to make contact with the slave chopper when a stinger hit us from the right bank. It was so fast that the pilots of the second helicopter hadn't even noticed when it launched. The rocket hit us squarely on the port side. Instantly, the contact fuse went off, and the steel dragonfly turned into a shapeless ball of fire, scattering debris, hitting the water, spraying a myriad of fiery spray, tearing human bodies to shreds. I woke up screaming. I should have died in that helicopter with the combatant. At the last moment, Koida threw me, badly wounded, into the first helicopter. I sat on the edge of the bed, and gradually the events of yesterday began to fill my brain. I turned my head. Natasha was not there. My first thought was that she had run away. Stolen what she could and run away. But at that moment, my nostrils caught the smell of food being cooked. The door to the kitchen slammed, and Natasha, in a sports jacket hanging down to her knees, entered the room. "Good morning. Breakfast is ready." She smiled as she stood on the floor barefoot. Somehow, I felt as comfortable as I hadn't felt in the past 6 months. Women can make comfort out of nothing. For a minute, it seemed like nothing had happened. I was with my family again. Now my wife would turn around, fix my bangs, and kiss my cheek. Sasha would climb onto my lap with joyful laughter. But her indifferent face stood before my eyes, and my good mood vanished at once. I pulled on my camouflage pants and staggered into the bathroom. In the mirror, I looked at myself, not yet old, an overgrown stubble man with an army badge on his neck. Looking at the silver oval on a leather cord, hidden in the battered gray hair on my chest, I thought for some reason that the war wasn't going to let me go anytime soon. I ran my finger down my cheek. I should shave. Or not. I wonder if unshavenness is still in fashion. It's not going to be an easy day. And the most important event for me would be a meeting with Vera. I splashed water on my face and scratched my hairy chest with pleasure. It was time to move out. I opened the door and saw Natasha standing behind it. "Everything is getting cold." I had breakfast with scrambled eggs and stew, drank a glass of tea, kissed the woman on the cheek, and went to get ready. I put on a t-shirt, a sweater, and a winter army jacket. Tying my shoes, I told Natasha, "Stay at home, don't go anywhere. I'll take care of business and come back for you. We'll go buy you some clothes." A question came to my mind, a question that had been on my mind since last night. "Where did you get the key to this apartment?" Natasha blushed instantly and looked away. "I used to live here with my grandfather." "What do you mean, lived here?" I had a bad feeling about it. In the literal sense. The old landlord was my grandfather. I lived with him for 1.5 years, working, looking after him. Everybody left him. No son, no daughter to look after him. And he had 2 heart attacks. He promised to sign the apartment over to me, but he didn't have time. The 3rd heart attack finished him off. Then his kids came and threw me out on the street. I lived at work for a while, until they fired me from there, too. Natasha spoke calmly, without emotion. It was obvious that she had long burned out. "Okay, it's a long story, you can tell me later." I buttoned my jacket and checked the tactical knife on my hip. I didn't take it because I feared for my life. I just remembered my father's words. A man should have 3 things in his pocket: a knife, a handkerchief, and $10. I wonder why my father didn't include protection in that list. The snowfall was over, the sky had cleared, and the cold winter sun was looking at me in a friendly way. I got into a cab I had ordered and called the address. It was a Sunday, and the city was clear of cars whizzing back and forth. I got out of the car and stood in front of the doorway for a while. About 3 meters away was a black SUV. There were 2 men sitting in the car, smoking with the window ajar, and 2 streams of gray smoke rising. I did not see anything else in particular. I walked up to the 4th floor and came to the door. Everything seemed normal for now. I inserted the key and turned it carefully. The lock clicked, and the door opened. Yesterday, when I left, I closed the lock with 2 turns. So there is someone in the apartment. It is unlikely Vera, she should come only 2 hours later. I carefully opened the door and slipped into the apartment. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. Silence. I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. I peeked through the doorway. There was a man lying awkwardly face down on the rug with his hand tucked under his arm. One shoe had slipped off his foot and lay lolling orphaned a little away from the rest of his body. To the without clothes eye, it was clear that he was long and safely dead, and did not enliven the scenery at all. Rather the opposite. The one word that pulsed through my head like red fire was fucked up. It was urgent to get out of here. I closed the front door just as quietly and began to carefully wipe the doorknob with my handkerchief. I heard the approaching howl of a police siren. Makes sense. Downstairs the entryway door slammed, and indistinct voices could be heard. The elevator clicked and rode down, obediently counting down the floors. I rushed to the top. Luckily for me, the attic was open. It was only a matter of minutes before I jumped out on the roof and ran to the last exit. On the way, I grabbed a broom that was by the wall and a big red bucket. It was quiet in the entryway. I quickly rolled down to the first floor and froze in front of the front door. Godspeed. I put the red bucket in front of me and walked out onto the porch. On the right were 2 police cars and a patrolman in a baggy, crumpled uniform with a submachine gun. I turned slowly to the left when I heard a stamping of feet behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw 2 cops rushing into the entryway. I rounded the corner, leaned my equipment carefully against the wall, and went out to the bus stop. In a few minutes, I was dangling like a sausage in a crowded salon. So that was it. Whose setup was this? I had one question on my mind so far. Clearly, there were cameras in the entryway. I had helped install them myself in my past life. But my jacket had a good hood up to my eyes. And I turned my head away just in time. I dialed Vera's number and moved the meeting to a place only we knew about. We were sitting at a table in a cozy cafe in an old, neglected city park. I loved that place. Sometimes on weekends, we would come here for ice cream. My wife would sit across from me and speak softly, trying not to meet my eyes. In her 3rd year of medical school, Vera fell in love, as they say, head over heels. Dennis was 5 years older and studied at the university in the law department. Tall, handsome, with beautiful brown eyes, and she, a blue-eyed blonde with a gorgeous figure. They complemented and shaded each other's beauty. Their romance was growing. The lovers wanted to get married, but decided to finish university first. Dennis rented a 1-room apartment in the city, and they began to live together. Vera did not notice anyone else. There was only one man for her, Dennis. Their parents were aware of this relationship and asked only one thing: to delay their child. To finish her studies and have a son or daughter in a legal marriage. Her final exams were over, and an internship was waiting for Vera in the fall. Dennis was going to leave for an internship in August. So they decided to schedule the wedding for July. On the eve of the wedding, Vera was in a state of euphoria of love, counting the days before the most important event in the life of any woman. The wedding dress was already being sewn, the restaurant was booked, and tickets to the honeymoon were booked. That night they made love, and when Vera woke up in the morning, she did not find Dennis beside her. She threw her robe over her bare body and walked barefoot into the kitchen. Strangely, he wasn't there either. Maybe he's in the bathroom? Not either. She went back into the kitchen again. An uneasy feeling crept into her heart. Where is he? Maybe he ran to the store? And suddenly Vera saw a white square of paper lying on the table, pressed with an empty coffee cup. She picked up the note and sat down on the stool. I'm sorry, but I've fallen in love with someone else. Don't look for me. That's life. It happens. The letters began to sprawl, and Vera thought her heart had stopped. She wanted to scream, but she didn't have enough air. The girl stood up and tried to go to the window, but suddenly the floor shook, and she lost consciousness. Vera came to her senses for a long time, even wanted to commit suicide. But she was young and soon met Edward. He even looked a little like Dennis. She dove headlong into her new love, and 3 months later they were married. 2 weeks after the wedding, Dennis showed up in town. He told her that he had made a mistake, that he loved only Vera. He suggested she leave her husband and go away with him. Vera was smart enough at the time not to give in to his exhortations. She did not leave her husband, but could not resist her former lover. They slept together. Then Dennis left. And a month later Vera found out that she was pregnant. There was no limit to Edward's joy. A daughter was born, Sasha. The husband adored his beloved girls. Edward was a military man, and the family wandered with him through garrisons. But they loved each other, all 3 of them. Finally, fate threw them into their native city. My husband went on fewer business trips, but those that were there lasted a long time. Edward started earning more money. Vera also went her way from an ordinary therapist in a district clinic to the head doctor of a medical center. Edward was only surprised at the rapid career of his wife. Nothing changed. They seemed to love each other even more firmly. Then Dennis found Vera. He matured into an imposing man. He transferred from the capital to the position of chairman of the regional court. His personal life did not work out, and he again began to seduce his former mistress. And Vera gave in. No, she did not fall out of love with Edward, after all, so many years together, but she could not resist the onslaught of her ex. They began to meet. Vera was torn between two men, not daring to give preference to someone. And then something happened that Vera had not expected. Dennis found out about Sasha and demanded a genetic test. A DNA test showed that he was her biological father. That solved everything. Vera was about to leave Edward. But he left on another long business trip. And a month later Vera learned that he had died. There was no body, as after the explosion of the helicopter, there was nothing left. Fate decided everything for her. Dennis brought her a paper from the military registration and enlistment office that her husband had died a hero's death. Vera was sad, and a week later she agreed to marry Dennis, having previously dissolved her marriage with Edward. They told Sasha that her mother's former husband was not her father, and she wiped away her tears and snot and rushed into Dennis's arms with a joyful squeal. Happy Dennis showered his beloved girls with gifts. He bought Sasha a car so she would not remember her not father who had raised and loved her for almost 20 years. Money solved everything. Everything was great, everyone was happy until the lively and disgusting first husband showed up. Vera stroked my arm and looked at me with inflamed eyes. Edward, it was a mistake. I really believed that you were dead. I even lit a candle for your repose. I had no idea it wasn't true. People from the Army registration office came to me and offered their condolences. Dennis handled the whole thing. He even made a request to your unit. They confirmed everything. Everything was clear. Dennis had cut off all the tails. Power and money had done their job. Love had nothing to do with it. Especially Sasha was his daughter. The family was reunited, and the loser was left with nothing. 20 years for nothing. She left me without a second thought, relieved that everything had worked itself out. Did she love me, or was she just adjusting? Who will know now? My thoughts swirled in my head like a flock of gray crows, constantly returning to my daughter. Her betrayal was killing me more than anything. Yes, I had spoiled their party, especially Sasha's. I stood up. All right, Vera. Do not grieve. I will not appear on your horizon anymore. Live and breathe calmly with both nostrils, and I will go further. Farewell. Edward, but I still love you. But it happened. This is fate. I left like a man, without turning around. My thoughts returned to the dead stranger in the apartment. It was clear that they were trying to set me up. But who and why? How did they know I would be in the apartment? Had they listened to my conversation with Vera? What for? Who did I step on the toes of so much that they decided to put me behind bars? Was it Dennis? I remembered his triumphant face at the party. Maybe he was afraid that Vera would come back to me. But if he was a man, he should understand that this was impossible. No matter the circumstances, I would never take Vera back, no matter how much I loved her. I won't be able to forgive the betrayal. Sasha? It's more complicated than that. A daughter, after all. But what daughter is she to me? She's his daughter. I still couldn't get over the DNA test results. In fact, because of it, Vera had defected to Dennis, long before my business trip. I patted my breast pocket. Then I took out a small cellophane bag with 2 fingers. I kept my daughter's hair in it, cut off when she was a year old. All this time, I kept it as a talisman. In my memory, she was always that little girl, my daughter, whom I loved with all my heart. I stopped and looked at the strand of blonde hair for a long time. Then I couldn't stand it and cried. The officer on duty at the city military registration and enlistment office looked at my prescription for a long time, as if he saw such a document for the first time. Then he gave it back to me and directed me to room 16. I knocked on the shabby door and entered the room without waiting for an answer. Behind the desk sat a major with a flabby face and a shabby greasy tunic. Wait in the corridor, this person didn't even bother to look at me. I don't have much time. I just need to get registered. I walked over to the table and placed the prescription on the edge of it. The major looked up at me with his pig eyes and suddenly shouted in a falsetto voice. What don't you understand? I told you to wait. I threw myself across the table, grabbed him by the lapels of his uniform, lifted him above the table, and calmly said, You should stand up when you talk to the colonel. The major somehow deflated at once, sniffed his nose, and covered his eyes, as if he expected me to hit him. I gently put the loose body back in its place and pushed a prescription to him with my index finger. Colonel Levin. Discharged by wound. I need to get on your payroll. I added some metal to my voice. Yes, just 1 minute. The major was slowly coming to his senses. Do you have your ID card with you? I handed him a green card. The major looked at the prescription, then at the photo in the ID card. Did you say Levin? He looked at me apprehensively. Yes, Colonel Levin. Is there something confusing you? Please, have a seat for a moment. I'll be right back. The major briskly jumped up from his chair and rushed out the door. My cell phone beeped. I looked at the screen. Another unfamiliar number. Hello? Edward Levin? A melodious woman's voice sounded. I am calling from the lawyer Podrodetsky's office. My name is Svetlana. Are you comfortable speaking? We've been looking for you for 3 months in connection with your father's will, Levin Ivan. A will? Did something happen to my father? I interrupted the gibbering maiden. There was a pause. You did not know? She said blameworthily. Your father died 3 months ago. We have found all the persons involved except you. The reading of the will is scheduled for tomorrow. Your presence is indispensable. I was shocked. My father died 3 months ago, and I had no idea. We were very far apart. My father never recovered from my mother's betrayal and elopement. It was as if his resentment toward his runaway wife had been transferred to me, their son. Over time, he began to avoid me. The last time we met was at his wedding. He married a young woman almost half his age. Then I went to military school and finally lost contact with him. Where will the reading of the will take place? I pulled myself together. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. in Mr. Podrodetsky's law office. But Mr. Isaac Podorecki asks you to come early. Bring your ID card or passport. Have a good day. The girl disconnected. I sat there for a while, pondering over what had happened. The will? My father's death. There was a knock at the door, and a panting major came in. Comrade Colonel, the commissar wants you to come in to see him. Come on, I'll show you where his office is. We went up to the 2nd floor and ended up in the reception area. When the receptionist saw us, she slowly rose and looked at me with surprised eyes. The major knocked politely and opened the door, letting me through. At the end of the long office, at a large desk, sat a gray-haired colonel. When I entered, he stood up and came out to meet me. Very glad to see you, Edward. He held out his hand to greet me and added, Lena, bring us a cafe. Then he turned to the major. You are dismissed. The major shuffled his foot, trying to reproduce the brave kick of his heels, turned over his left shoulder, and disappeared. Sit down. The colonel nodded at 2 armchairs by a massive coffee table covered with a white tablecloth. Noiselessly, the secretary came in and quickly arranged a plate with sliced sausages on the white tablecloth, put an open can of chicken pâté beside it, and placed a small sliced loaf of bread. She also put an open bottle of vodka in a misted bottle and 2 glasses. Literate girl, I remarked to myself. The military commander poured vodka. Welcome back, Colonel. He raised the glass, and we cheeked. We drank and had a quick snack. I'm glad you're here. There was a stir around you, you know. They say you died a hero's death. One guy, in particular, tried. He even put in a request for you. We sent it too, as soon as the funeral letter arrived. His answer was earlier. He said it was true. You're dead. I even went to your wife for condolences. But last week, we got an answer to our inquiry that you were alive and not quite well. You've been sent back to civilian life. It's a merry-go-round. You tell your wife what's going on. If you need to apologize officially, I'll come over." The colonel poured a second one. I shrugged. "It's okay, don't worry." Everything was already explained to her. The commissar caught something in my voice and looked at me understandingly. "Well, to the fallen." The commissar raised his glass. We drank without shouting. We sat and had a quiet time. We poured a third. The colonel got up and went to the table. He came back, clutching something in his palm. "Here, I specially sent a man to the capital." He handed me a box. I slowly opened it. A ray of sunlight ran down my hand and reflected on the red enameled order, sunk in the blue velvet. The conversation with the commissar confirmed Vera's words. Dennis wanted to bury me so badly that he even sent a request to my unit. "I see, Judge, there are such possibilities. All the more at stake own daughter and former mistress." Before I reached home, I visited another godforsaken place and placed an urgent order, paying triple the speed charge. There was one question that kept bugging me, and I wanted to resolve it as quickly as possible. I opened the door and the aroma of freshly cooked food reached me. Natasha appeared from the kitchen. "You're just in time. Dinner is already ready." And her eyes shone with joy and pride at having cooked food on time. The complete illusion of family. I sighed, undressed, and went to wash my hands. We took a cab through several boutiques. Natasha was terribly shy, but her feminine side won out. I bought her winter boots, a warm jacket, a woolen suit, a down scarf, and even a cocktail dress. I never understood why. I even bought a bathrobe and slippers. That's not counting the special lady stuff, the purpose of which was a mystery to me. Natasha's cheeks even turned red with excitement. Then there was the beauty parlor, where I almost fell asleep waiting for my lady. To top it all off, we stopped at a restaurant, and Natasha showed off her new dress to the world. The audience looked at the strange couple with amazement. An unshaven man in camouflage and a young glamorous lady. At first, they didn't even want to let me in. But a good tip melted the icy heart of the maitre d'. I watched my companion out of the corner of my eye. For a bum, she had two good manners. She ate beautifully, using the cutlery expertly. When the lobster was served, she unmistakably chose the right tongs to cut it. Apparently, this woman had lived a very different life in her day. I sat, tasting the tart wine, and imperceptibly surveyed the hall. The hall was gradually filled with people, and the noise level increased, fueled by alcohol. At last, the shaggy-haired band played something slow. People woke up and went to the dance floor. "Let me ask you to dance." A floppy man loomed up at our table. Natasha looked at me, and I read it in her eyes. The girl does not dance. I smiled politely. "No one's asking you, uncle." The boy reached his hand out to Natasha. "My husband explained everything to you." Natasha didn't even dignify the flunky with a glance. "All right, I'll be back." The unsuccessful beau began to drift slowly toward his table. "Can we go?" Natasha looked at me pleadingly. "Husband?" She said, "Husband." I looked at my companion in surprise. She was terrified. The prospect of combat contact clearly did not inspire her. I, on the contrary, liked everything. Even the threat of a fight. What could be more pleasant than a fight over a woman? Testosterone was bubbling in my body, demanding an outlet. I poured myself a shot glass from a misted decanter that looked like a diver. The vodka rustled down my esophagus and landed softly in my stomach. Now a salty pickle. I even squeezed my eyes shut with pleasure. You can't drink vodka alone. Only with an hors d'oeuvre. With a pickle or a green tomato. And then, after that, something meaty, lard, or cold cuts. I picked up a pickled mushroom with a fork, imperceptibly looking around the room. Some movement at the entrance drew my attention. The maitre d' hotel escorted the new guests to a free niche. Yes, it's a small world. The first to his table gracefully walked Vera, followed by a haughty look of a mistress of life, Sasha. Well, the current Vera husband I know, but the young botanist next to my former daughter, I see for the first time. The four sat down at the table and began to study the menu. The waiter and the maitre d', who was glowing with joy, were waiting for the order. It was clear that the judge and his companions were known, loved, and appreciated. Suddenly, I caught Vera's gaze on me. She saw me, and there was a range of feelings on her face. From surprise to anger. It was clear that my young companion caused her to be jealous in the first place. Worse to see his ex in the company of a charming and, most importantly, a young companion. Vera tilted her head and said something to Sasha. In a moment, both of them were staring at me. I do not know why, but I was in a bad mood. Shall we go home? I smiled at Natasha. Let's get some coffee. It was obvious that she didn't want to leave. I called the waitress. Bring us some coffee and count us out, please. The musicians played a slow song again. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw out of the table where Vera was resting with the new family noticeably swaying headed twirly swiveled man. He grinned and came up to Sasha and said something, leaning toward her ear. She answered, and her answer clearly did not please the drunken gentleman. He grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her onto the dance floor. The nerd sitting with her started to object, but the gentleman paid no attention to him, continuing to drag Sasha to dance. Dennis, who was sitting across from her, got up from his seat and began to look for the administrator, who, lo and behold, had vanished into thin air. It was clear that the new father himself would not interfere in the brewing conflict. I did not feel comfortable. After all, she had been my daughter for 20 years. I intercepted a pleading look from Vera. Sit down, I'll be right there. I finished eating pickled mushrooms, wiped my lips with a napkin, and headed to the hotbed of flaring conflict. The man with a donkey's stubbornness dragged Sasha to the dance floor. She helplessly looked around at the nerd, lowered his head, and said something nervously on his cell phone to Dennis. Sasha broke free and tried to take a step back. Then the cheeky man grabbed her tighter, forcing her to stop. She tried to release her elbow, but he held it tight. Stop! You can't get away from me, you'll have to dance. He kept her on the dance floor, dragging her back toward him. Now is the time to interfere. Young man. Shame on you. Now let the girl go. Sasha's face appeared hopeful on the face of a major unspeakable surprise. I moved directly at them, on the move correcting slanted glasses. You see? The girl does not want to dance. I tried to get closer. Leave her alone, please. You. I'll get you. The young man clearly lacked the words to express his indignation and frighten me at the same time. He let go of Sasha's hand and with his head down threw himself on me like a bull at a rodeo. Well, that was easy. I took a step to the left while turning my body at the same time. The young jerk's body rushed past me like a torpedo. At the last moment, he must have realized that he was flying past me, but he could not stop. A nimble footstep and the hooligan collapsed with all his might, with a characteristic clatter of his head hitting the marble-tiled floor. After a couple of meters of inertia, the man's head struck the Christmas tree, which stood in the middle of the hall, and fell silent. The flight, said someone from the audience. Sasha looked at me stunned. I turned to Vera and shrugged. Then returned to his table, poured vodka, and drank in a gulp. Get out, we need to go. I looked at Natasha. She nodded. A waitress hopped up. I quickly paid the bill, and me and Natasha headed out into the foyer. I was about to go outside to the cab that was waiting for us when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Edward! I turned around. Tears were glistening in Vera's eyes. Thank you. She wanted to say something else, but I silently walked out the door. When I woke up, Natasha was gone. There was a towel-covered plate of sandwiches on the kitchen table, and the kettle was still hot on the stove. I looked in the bathroom, but my friend wasn't there either. It looked like Natasha had left. I pulled out my wallet. The money and credit cards were there, so were the documents. The cell phone beeped, receiving a text message. I looked at the glowing screen. Svetlana, the lawyer's assistant, had sent me the address of Mr. Podgorodetsky's office. I glanced at my watch. It was time to call a cab. But Natasha's sudden disappearance kept bothering me. All right, I'll go to the lawyer, and then I'll decide what to do. To avoid shocking the honorable lawyer and the rest of the audience, I shaved, put on a clean white shirt, a black jacket, and jeans. At the appointed time, I arrived. I thought I would be the first to arrive, but when, accompanied by my lawyer, we entered his office, decorated with a large Christmas tree, I saw a young, spectacularly dressed blonde. Meet! This is Jean, your father's wife. Podgorodetsky introduced me to the lady with the air of a socialite lion. Edward Levin, son of Ivan Levin. I bowed politely, and she nodded to me, nervously smoking a long cigarette and carelessly shaking off the ash into a large glass ashtray. There was a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of her. I had never met her before, but the last time I talked to my father on the phone, I knew he had remarried. I didn't know where his old wife had gone. All right, everybody's here. Can we get started? The vividly colored woman fidgeted impatiently in her chair. From the wall stood an unassuming man in a gray suit with a leather folder in his hands. We must wait a little longer, not everyone is here. He coughed and began to wipe his glasses, squinting his nearsighted eyes. I understood that he was the notary. Why, does someone else have to come up? Jean looked around the room. As far as I know, there are 2 heirs. Alas, there are more heirs. The notary smiled tautly. We cannot open the will without their presence. Despite his shabby appearance, his voice was firm. I realized at once that he was not as simple as he wanted to seem. The door opened, and a very beautiful woman in a strict business suit and a chic hat entered the office. This is Mrs. Violetta Bermont, the first wife of Mr. Levin. The lawyer bent down in a half bow and pushed back his chair, inviting the lady to sit down. I sat and looked at the woman in silence. Is that my mother? After all these years, she had come to share her ex-husband's inheritance. So this was the surprise the lawyer had told me about before the event. But the notary was in no hurry to start and looked at his watch several times. We were waiting for someone else. Thoughts raced through my head at breakneck speed. I had so many questions that my mind could not process the emotions that were rushing through it. But I tried to pull myself together. Jean, too, looked from me to her mother, perplexed. Only Mrs. Bermont seemed unperturbed. She nodded imposingly to the notary and the lawyer. What are we waiting for, gentlemen? Get on with it. She pronounced without paying the slightest attention to me. Wait a minute, not everybody is here yet. Podgorodetsky stared tensely at the front door. It creaked, and Natasha came in. She sat down in a helpful chair, staring at me in disbelief. Then quickly averted her eyes, as if she had erected an insurmountable barrier between us. Honestly, I was stunned myself. Too many surprises today. The lawyer sighed in relief. Well, everyone is here, we can begin. He nodded to the notary. He sat down in his chair and opened the file. Gentlemen heirs, the will was made by the deceased Ivan Levin a month before his death. There are no more documents concerning the inheritance. He read the preamble and went to the essence of the will. I leave all movable and immovable property belonging to me to my last wife, Jean Lavina. You could hear Jean squeak with happiness. I leave the sum of $5,000 in my bank account to my first wife, Violetta Bermont, and my daughter, Natalia Zagorskaya, in equal shares, that is $2,500 each. At these words, Natasha shuddered. I am disinheriting my son, Edward Levin. Then came the enumeration of the officials in whose presence the will had been made. There was a pause. Everyone was stunned, looking at me and Natasha. It was as if I had fallen down a deep well. Natasha is my sister? I looked up. Natasha was looking at me the exact same way. My mother got up from her chair without so much as a glance at me. The others got up as well. Jean did not hide her joy, glancing triumphantly at me and Natasha. One moment, gentlemen. The lawyer took the floor again. There are some more nuances. He looked at the file lying on the table and nodded to the notary. The fact is that 6 months ago, Mr. Levin gave his property, including the construction company, to Mrs. Natasha Zagorskaya. If Zhanna would object and try to challenge this decision in court, he asked to betray it to her. The lawyer handed Zhanna an envelope with pictures in it. Zhanna snatched it from the lawyer's hands and began to examine the contents. You could see by her face that she was in shock. One photo fell out of her hands and onto the floor. I managed to see that it showed a half without clothes Jean in the arms of a swarthy macho man. I caught Natasha's cold and somewhat lifelessly detached gaze. She, without saying a word, quickly left the lawyer's office, so fast that I didn't even have time to approach her and congratulate her on the unexpected wealth that had fallen into her lap. I thought she was waiting for me at the entrance to the building, but she wasn't there either. That's strange. What made her disappear so quickly without a word to me? Maybe I thought too much of myself. After one night? My mother also disappeared without a word to me. Well, I did not expect anything special, so my father's decision did not drive me into despair. I have my arms and legs, my health too, for now. I used to live without a lot of money, and I will live now. Life is a strange thing. It changes people before my eyes. Yesterday I had a woman with me, to whom, let it be said, I was attached with all my heart. And now, by the will of fate, becoming a rich promising lady, she coldly abandoned me, throwing me away like a used pad. Even Jean was a little sympathetic to me. She touched my elbow. Come on, let's drink, celebrate, so to speak. She smirked bitterly. I said no. I walked down the park alley, kicking the December snow, not yet frozen. The wind hit my face, smearing snow dust on my cheeks. It made contact with my burning cheeks and turned into water droplets that looked so much like tears. Apparently, along with the wind, I was sad about something I could never get back. My cell phone rang. I read the text message. My order was ready, and I could pick it up at any time. I stared at the yellow envelope of thick paper for a long time, and then carefully cut the edge off. Well, in principle, as I thought. At that moment, the phone vibrated in my pocket. Vera. Something often began to get in my way. Edward, do not hang up. We need to urgently meet. She almost shouted. Will you come up to our cafe? I walked over to the table where Vera was sitting, not knowing where to put my hands from the excitement. She looked like a beautiful, sensual woman, which, in fact, she was. She even stood up when she saw me. You said you wanted to talk. Infuriated by my callousness and brevity, Vera looked at me in surprise. What happened? I looked around for the waitress. Dennis was arrested. Edward, I don't know what to do. Vera was almost crying. Calm down and tell me more. At least one good news, I thought to myself. He was detained right in the office. Not charged yet, but something to do with murder and gold smuggling. Through sobs, said Vera. What should I do? It is difficult for me to say anything about this. This is your husband and Sasha's father. You will carry a parcel to him in prison. Vera looked at me with horror. I was sitting in front of the woman I once loved like no one else. Until she broke my heart. What did you want? I don't have to help you. You made your choice. I knew I was being cruel, but I couldn't deny myself. I would never have left you if it hadn't been for Sasha. Vera looked at me through her tears. I wanted the girl to have a real father. She was silent, realizing what a fool she had said, and I realized where she was going with it. Well, there you have it, Sasha has a real father now. The only thing left is to wait for him to come out of jail. She looked me in the eye. I knew she was trying to tell from my eyes what kind of mood I was in. She used to be able to do that. I miss you. I want to have what we had before. I love you. I need you, Vera said pleadingly. You didn't need me when you were with him. How can you say you love me when you lied to me and made a fool of me? In the last year of our marriage you were with him, too. Slept with him. Loved him. Vera sensed the contempt in my voice. Your love flared up before my business trip. And then you found out I was dead. You did not need documentation of my death. you took your lover at his word. I continued. You were relieved that everything had resolved itself. She lowered her head in shame and said, I am so sorry. I don't know what I thought. I guess I wasn't thinking at all. Lifting her head and looking at me with tear-filled eyes, she added, I'm so sorry. If it hadn't been for Sasha, I never would have left you. I looked silently at the weeping woman. Once my heart would have melted from her tears, but now I felt only boiling anger, which had no compassion. Edward! Let's give it all back. After you came, I can't live in peace. I really love you. Only you. No one else. Please. I made a mistake. Just take me back. Apparently my silence gave Vera some hope. You did all this for your daughter? You reunited the family? And the fact that I raised her for 20 years wasn't an obstacle for you? I saw the daughter's attitude toward me. You did a good job of re-educating her. I shook my head and stood up. You brought this on yourself. Now take a full spoonful. I spoke calmly, almost impassively. As for Sasha, read this. I put the expanded document in front of Vera. She read the paper and her face seemed to swim. God, it can't be. She was in shock. It can. Your lover fooled you here, too. With his connections, it's easy to do a DNA test. Sasha was my daughter, biologically and in life. Goodbye. Wait. Please, can we? She started. We have nothing to wait for, and we can't do anything. It's perfectly clear to me. You've made your choice. We're done. Go back to him. Go back to your husband, I said and headed for the exit of the cafe. And in the evening my mother came to see me. She stood on the poorly lit landing and looked at me. May I come in? She asked in a slightly husky voice. I moved aside. Who gave you my address? I closed the door. Counselor, you wrote it down when you filled out the form. She went into the room. Is this your apartment? Her mother either asked or stated it as a fact and glanced around the modestly furnished drawing room. No, I rent it temporarily. I was surprised that my mother's visit did not arouse any emotion in me. And where do you live? My mother asked me. I do not know yet, no plans for the future. Are you married? I was recently divorced. Why? I thought my mother looked at me with sympathy. I remained silent. I didn't want to reveal my soul to a stranger. I understand that you can't feel anything but hatred towards me. But believe me, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about you. Your father was a terrible man. I only endured that hell for a year and a half. Yes, I left you very young, but believe me, I had no other choice. My mother pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, wiping or pretending to wipe away her tears. There was a pause. Mother sobbed a few times. She sounded like she was really crying. Is she still capable of it? I was very surprised when my lawyer called me and invited me to the reading of the will, the mother continued. I did not have any relations with Ivan since I left. And then suddenly the will, and even money. She smiled sadly. Edward, you don't know everything. Before I got married, I dated a guy, his name was Sergey. We were getting ready to get married. We'd already bought rings. But then Ivan intervened. I do not know how he persuaded, or maybe forced Sergey to give me up. And my lover left me, not knowing I was pregnant. A month later I married Ivan, and 8 months later I gave birth to you. We lived more or less comfortably for almost a year and a half. And then Ivan started to look at you, trying to find a resemblance to himself. He got the idea that you weren't his son. He took a DNA test and it all came out. That night he beat me up. He screamed that I was a society girl. Ivan took all my jewelry, even my wedding ring. He beat me almost every day. And I couldn't take it anymore. One day, when he was at work, I kissed you one last time and left. I couldn't take you with me. I had some money, so I bought a ticket and went to the capital. I had a third cousin living there. I could hardly find her and begged her on my knees not to throw me out on the street. She took pity on me and let me live there. She got me a job as a waitress in a cafe. That's where I met Ahmed. Ahmed started courting me. They know how to turn naive fools' heads. He promised to marry me. Offered to go to his parents in Egypt. I agreed, bitten by his tales of the beautiful life. But instead of meeting my parents and getting married, I ended up in a brothel. My mother covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. For 3 years I had been in hell. I accepted my fate as payback for abandoning my child. I worked all day long, on sheets soaked with sweat, unable even to wash. Once a day, a bucket of water was brought to the little pencil box, fenced off with blankets, so that I could wash a little. And then it went on again. It was the German Peter Bermont who got me out of there. I don't know how he managed to buy me out of slavery. He took me to Germany. He offered to take me back home. But I flatly refused. I was afraid I'd ruin your life. A few years later I married Peter. But we had no children. The years I spent in a brothel and the several abortions I had. After almost 10 years I came to our town. I saw you. But I was afraid of hurting you, so I watched you from the sidelines. I met with your grandmother in secret, gave her money and begged her not to tell anyone that I was here. And then your grandmother died, you went away, and I lost you. Today, when I saw you, my heart started pounding so hard. I thought everyone could hear it beating. I know you could never forgive me, but I had to tell you all this. Where's your husband now? I poured a glass of water and handed it to my mother. He died a year ago, I live alone now. He left me some money and I have enough. His grown-up children are good to me, they even come to visit. I went to the window. Everything became clear to me. Ivan was not my father, that's why he treated me so coldly. And, in the end, deprived me of my inheritance. Yes, what a twist. A real Santa Barbara. So Natasha wasn't my sister either. Mother stood up. She took a bag from her purse and put it on the coffee table. Here is the money. Please take it. I looked at her silently, trying to look into her eyes. Is this compensation for the lack of motherly love? I smirked. She flinched as if she'd been hit, then shrank back somehow and lowered her head and went into the hallway. I didn't go to see her off. On the threshold, she turned around. Tears were streaming from her eyes. Forgive me, son. She whispered these words almost silently and went to the front door. Had I forgiven her? To be honest, I did not know myself. One thing was clear to me, I had loved her all this time, though I could never remember her face. And then something snapped inside me. I suddenly felt like that little boy again, whom my mother had once left me. Mommy, Mommy. It was hard for me to speak. Spasms were choking me by the throat. Tears streamed from my eyes until my mother's warm, native hand pressed my head to her chest. The day before New Year's Eve, the thaw was replaced by real frost. I approached the 2-story mansion, lost in the depths of the snow-covered park. Careful not to slip, I climbed the frost-covered steps. It was quite early, and the janitor had not yet had time to clean them and sprinkle them with sand and salt. I barely got up on the porch as the door swung open, as if I was deliberately waiting. Who do you want? A sleepy maid inquired grudgingly, pressing her hand to her mouth to conceal a yawn. Good morning. I am looking for Natalia Zadarskaya. The landlady is still asleep and has told me not to disturb her. Tell the landlady Edward Levin wants to see her. The maid, without uttering a word, shut the door in my face. Well, we shall have to wait. I smoked, inhaling deeply the cigarette smoke along with the frosty air. The door opened. It was the same maid. The landlady said she knew no one by that name. Go away, or I'll call the guard. I thought I saw the figure of a half-without-clothes young man behind her. Well, I already knew how easily and thoughtlessly cruel women cut old ties. Yesterday she was still in love, but today the situation had changed, and she had stepped over me. I took off my glove and stretched out my palm. The snowflakes fell into it tentatively, as if afraid of something, immediately melting. just as my fleeting hope for simple human happiness had just melted. Everything around me was white: the path, the burlap-covered rose bushes for the winter, the trees in the park. Only flitting snowfinches, bright red spots enlivened the dull white landscape. One should never cling to the past. And at that moment my cell phone rang to life. "Edward?" asked from the tube unfamiliar male voice. "I have a proposition for you. Be there tonight at 7 p.m. in the restaurant of the Plaza Hotel. I know you, so I'll come myself. P.S. It was only 3 days of my still not very long life. It was a small episode, full of events. What awaited me ahead, I did not know. But time heals wounds. When fate closes a door, it opens another. The main thing is not to lose heart and find it. I managed to find and open that door. But that's another story. What do you think of our story today?" To me, the main character post-pupilized as much as possible nasty to her husband, but the plot was on top. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.